Innocence died on a scaffold 10 years ago, but the truth remained buried far deeper. England, 1825. The morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains of the cottage, casting pale shadows across the small parlour, where Charlotte Fairmont sat hunched over her sewing. Her needle moved with steady precision through the silk fabric, each stitch a small rebellion against the poverty that threatened to consume her family. At 27, her hands bore the calluses of a woman who had fought for survival longer than most ladies of her former station could imagine. The cottage was modest, almost cramped, with its low ceilings and narrow rooms that seemed to press in during the long winter months. Yet it was home, the only sanctuary the Fairmont children had known since the world turned its back on them 10 years ago. The walls held memories both bitter and sweet, whispers of a life that had been torn away with the brutal efficiency of a court's verdict. "Charlotte, I finished the arithmetic problems you assigned." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his 16-year-old frame filling the space with the promise of the man he would become. His brown hair, so like their father's, fell across his forehead as he held out the slate, covered in careful calculations. Charlotte set down her sewing and accepted the slate, her green eyes scanning the neat rows of numbers. "These are excellent, Thomas. Your father would have been proud." The mention of their father brought a familiar tightness to her chest, but she refused to let it show. Strength was all she had left to give her siblings, and she would not squander it on the luxury of grief. "Do you think he really did it?" Thomas asked quietly. The question he had asked 100 times before, each iteration carrying the weight of a boy trying to understand how his world had shattered. "Do you think father truly betrayed England?" Charlotte reached for her brother's hand, squeezing gently. "I think our father loved his country and his family. I think he died with honour, even if the world refuses to see it." The sound of footsteps on the stairs heralded the arrival of Margaret, 14 and already showing signs of the beauty that would have made her the toast of any London season had their circumstances been different. Behind her came the twins, Peter and Anne, 11 years old and still young enough to sometimes forget the weight of the name they carried. "The bread is ready," Margaret announced, brushing flour from her worn dress. "Though we are nearly out of butter again." "I will purchase more when I deliver Mrs. Ashworth's gown tomorrow," Charlotte replied, returning to her needlework. The irony of sewing for the woman whose daughter would likely never acknowledge her on the street was not lost on her, but pride was another luxury the Fairmonts could not afford. Peter bounded into the room with the energy of a boy who refused to be constrained by poverty or scandal. "Charlotte, may I show you the equation I created? It is a pattern I discovered in the way numbers can be arranged." Despite the weariness that seemed to settle deeper into her bones with each passing year, Charlotte smiled. Peter's gift for mathematics was undeniable, a bright spark of potential that deserved nurturing. If only she could afford proper tutors, proper schools, proper lives for all of them. "After breakfast," she promised. "Anne, did you practice your scales this morning?" The girl nodded, her delicate features lighting with pleasure. "Mr. Hendricks says the piano needs tuning again, but I did my best. Would you like to hear the new melody I composed?" "This evening," Charlotte agreed. "We must all attend to our duties first." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a soft knock at the cottage door announced the arrival of William Hendricks. The elderly man had served as head butler to the Earl of Fairmont for 30 years before the family's fall from grace. When others had abandoned them, when creditors had seized the manor and scattered the servants to new positions, Hendricks alone had remained loyal. It was his cottage that sheltered them now, a small property he had purchased decades ago with careful savings. The gesture had quite literally saved them from destitution, though Charlotte suspected it had cost him any hope of a comfortable retirement. "Good morning, Miss Charlotte." Hendricks greeted her with the same formal courtesy he had shown when she was the daughter of an earl rather than a seamstress living on charity. His silver hair was neatly combed, his posture still rigid despite his 70 years. "I have brought eggs from the market and some news from town." "You are too generous, Mr. Hendricks," Charlotte said, accepting the basket he offered. The eggs would supplement their meagre breakfast, and she made a mental note to somehow repay his kindness, though she knew he would never accept it. "Please sit. Margaret will pour you tea." As the old butler settled into the worn armchair by the fireplace, Charlotte noticed the tension in his weathered features. "What news troubles you?" Hendricks glanced at the children, then back to Charlotte. "Perhaps we might speak privately." A cold dread settled in Charlotte's stomach. In her experience, private conversations rarely brought good tidings. She set aside her sewing and led Hendricks to the small kitchen, closing the door behind them. "The Duke of Lindworth has returned to London," Hendricks said without preamble. "I saw his carriage yesterday near the house where you deliver your sewing." Charlotte's hands clenched at her sides. The Duke of Lindworth, son of Edmund Greymont, the man whose testimony had sealed her father's fate. 10 years had passed since that terrible day in the courtroom, but Charlotte remembered every detail with painful clarity. She had been 17, dressed in her finest gown, because her mother had insisted they must present themselves with dignity, even as their world crumbled around them. The courtroom had been packed with spectators eager to witness the downfall of the Earl of Fairmont, accused of selling military secrets to France. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as broken glass. Her father had stood in the dock with his shoulders squared and his head high, refusing to bow beneath the weight of accusations he swore were false. Charlotte had sat beside her mother in the gallery, watching as witness after witness came forward to speak against him. Minor officials, military officers, men whose faces she had never seen before that day. And then the Duke of Greymont had taken the stand. Edmund Greymont, Duke of Lindworth, had been an imposing figure with iron-grey hair and cold blue eyes that surveyed the courtroom as though all present were beneath his notice. His testimony had been devastating in its detail, describing documents he claimed to have discovered, conversations he alleged to have overheard, patterns of behaviour that painted the Earl of Fairmont as a traitor to king and country. "I take no pleasure in this," the Duke had said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "The Earl and I have known each other since our youth. But duty to England must supersede personal friendship. I cannot remain silent when I know with certainty that this man has betrayed us all." Charlotte had watched her father's face as the Duke spoke, seeing the confusion and dawning horror as he realized the depth of the conspiracy against him. He had tried to speak, to defend himself, but his words had seemed hollow against the authority of a duke's testimony. The verdict had been swift. Guilty. The sentence equally so. Death. Her mother had collapsed in the gallery. Charlotte had been too numb with shock to cry. She had simply sat there, frozen, as guards led her father away in chains. He had looked back once, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room, and she had seen the desperate message in his gaze: "Protect your family." The execution had taken place 3 weeks later. Charlotte had not been allowed to attend, but she had heard the church bells toll that morning, announcing that justice had been served. Her mother had taken to her bed and never truly recovered, dying of what the physician called a broken heart 2 years later, leaving Charlotte alone to raise her siblings. "Miss Charlotte," Hendricks' voice pulled her back to the present. "Are you well?" She realized her hands were shaking and clasped them together tightly. "Why does it matter that the Duke has returned? We live in different worlds now. Our paths will never cross. I thought you should be warned," Hendricks said gently. "In case you encounter him during your errands, I would not wish you to be unprepared." Charlotte nodded, drawing a steadying breath. "Thank you for your consideration, but the Duke of Lindworth is of no consequence to me. He is simply another aristocrat in a city full of them." Yet even as she spoke the words, she knew them for a lie. The Duke of Lindworth would always be the son of the man who destroyed her family. No amount of time or distance could change that simple, bitter truth. When she returned to the parlour, she found Peter showing Thomas his mathematical discoveries, while Anne played softly at the old piano. Margaret was setting out the meagre breakfast, stretching their supplies with the skill born of necessity. These were her responsibilities now. These 3 young souls who depended on her for everything from food to education to hope for the future. Charlotte picked up her sewing once more, the silk slippery beneath her fingers. The gown she was creating was for Lady Victoria Ashworth, who would wear it to some grand ball where she would dance with eligible gentlemen and never spare a thought for the fallen seamstress who had stitched every seam. That was the way of the world, Charlotte had learned. The fortunate rarely thought of those they had left behind. "Will we ever go to a ball, Charlotte?" Anne asked wistfully, abandoning her piano practice to lean against her older sister's chair. Will we ever wear beautiful gowns and dance? Charlotte stroked the child's soft brown hair, so like her own. Perhaps someday, little one. When we have built ourselves back up, when the world has forgotten old scandals and sees only who we are now. It was a pretty lie, the kind she told to give her siblings something to dream about. In truth, Charlotte knew they would never reclaim what had been lost. The children of executed traitors did not receive invitations to balls. They did not make advantageous marriages or find their place in society. They simply survived, day by day, and tried to build lives from the ashes of their parents' ruin. But she would not burden Anne with that harsh reality. Let the child dream a little longer. As the morning sun climbed higher, filling the cottage with pale winter light, Charlotte continued her sewing. Each stitch was a small defiance, a refusal to surrender to the fate that society had decreed for them. She would keep her family together. She would keep them fed and clothed and educated as best she could. And she would never, ever forgive the men who had made such struggles necessary, especially not the Duke who had sealed her father's doom with his testimony. The study of Lindworth House stood silent in the late afternoon light, dust motes dancing through the air as Alexander Greymont, Duke of Lindworth, surveyed the chaos he had created. Papers covered every surface of the massive oak desk that had belonged to his father. Documents and ledgers spread in careful disorder as he continued the task he had begun 3 years ago upon inheriting the dukedom. Organizing his father's affairs had proven more complex than anticipated, not because Edmund Greymont had been careless with his records, but because he had been extraordinarily meticulous in concealing certain aspects of his business. Alexander had discovered this gradually, finding small inconsistencies that led to larger questions, until he had become convinced that his father's papers held secrets that demanded investigation. At 32, Alexander bore little resemblance to his father beyond the dark hair they shared. Where Edmund had been cold and calculating, driven by ambition and a hunger for power that had defined every action, Alexander had spent his adult life attempting to distance himself from that legacy. He believed in justice, in using his considerable position and wealth to implement reforms that might actually improve the lives of those less fortunate. His father had found such notions laughably naive. "You are a duke," Edmund had said during one of their final conversations before his death. "Your duty is to preserve your position and expand your influence. Sentiment is for lesser men who can afford such luxuries." Alexander had never agreed, and the 3 years since his father's passing had only reinforced his conviction that the old duke's philosophy had been fundamentally corrupt. Yet he had never suspected the depth of that corruption until today. The discovery had come by accident, as such things often did. He had been searching for the deed to a minor property in Sussex when his hand had brushed against an irregularity in the wood panelling at the back of the desk's largest drawer. Curious, he had pressed and prodded until a hidden compartment had sprung open, revealing a stack of letters bound with black ribbon. His first thought had been that they might be love letters, some remnant of a romance his father had hidden from his cold marriage to Alexander's mother. But the handwriting on the first envelope had been masculine, and the return address had made Alexander's blood run cold. Philippe Marchand, a French name. A name he recognized from reports about enemy agents during the war. With trembling fingers, Alexander had broken the seal and unfolded the letter within. What he read there had shattered every illusion he had maintained about his father's honor. The letters detailed a conspiracy of staggering scope. For years, Edmund Greymont had been selling military intelligence to France, using his position and connections to access sensitive information that he then passed along to enemy agents for substantial sums of money. The correspondence laid it all out with business-like efficiency. Troop movements, supply routes, strategic plans that had cost English lives. But it was the final letter in the stack that had made Alexander physically ill. "My dear Duke," it read in flowing script, "your concerns about the investigation are noted. I agree that a scapegoat must be found to divert suspicion. The Earl of Fairmont seems an excellent candidate, given his access to similar information and his unfortunate tendency toward financial difficulties. I leave the details of the frame to your capable hands. Once he is eliminated, your position will be secure, and our profitable arrangement may continue. The letter was dated 3 months before the Earl of Fairmont's arrest. Alexander had sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, rereading the letters until their damning contents were seared into his memory. His father had not merely been a traitor, he had been a murderer, condemning an innocent man to death to preserve his own treacherous activities. The Earl of Fairmont had been innocent, all these years, executed and reviled as a traitor, and he had been nothing more than a convenient sacrifice. Alexander's first instinct had been denial. Perhaps the letters were forgeries, some elaborate hoax, but the handwriting was unmistakably his father's, and the details too specific to be fabricated. Moreover, several of the letters referenced transactions that Alexander had found evidence of in his father's financial records, payments listed as investments that now took on a far more sinister meaning. His second instinct had been to destroy the letters, to burn them and pretend he had never found them. What good would revealing the truth do now? His father was dead. The Earl was dead. Dragging the scandal into the light would only tarnish the Lindworth name and achieve nothing. But that instinct lasted only moments before shame replaced it. An innocent man had died. His family had been destroyed, left to bear the stigma of treason, while the true traitor had continued living in luxury and respect. How could Alexander claim to care about justice if he allowed such an injustice to stand? He had immediately hired Nathaniel Price, a private investigator known for his discretion and thoroughness. "Find the Fairmont family," Alexander had instructed. "I need to know where they are, how they live. Everything." Price had returned 2 weeks later with a report that had deepened Alexander's sense of obligation. The widow had died years ago, leaving the eldest daughter to raise 4 younger siblings alone. They lived in poverty on the charity of an elderly butler, the girl working as a seamstress while attempting to educate her brothers and sisters in a cottage that could barely contain them all. Charlotte Fairmont, 27 years old, unmarried because no respectable man would align himself with a traitor's daughter, sacrificing any hope of her own future to ensure her siblings had food and shelter and the rudiments of an education. "She is remarkable," Price had said, his professional detachment giving way to genuine admiration. "I watched her for several days as you requested. She works from dawn until late into the night, yet she never shows frustration or despair. The children clearly adore her. The boy Thomas works odd jobs to help with expenses, though he cannot be more than 16. The daughter Margaret manages the household with supplies that would shame most beggars. The younger 2, twins named Peter and Anne, still have laughter in them despite everything." Alexander had taken to observing the cottage himself after that, standing across the lane in the early morning hours to watch the family begin their day. He saw Charlotte emerge to draw water from the well, her movements efficient despite obvious exhaustion. He saw the children gather for lessons at the small table, Peter's enthusiasm for mathematics evident even from a distance, Anne's fingers dancing over the keys of an ancient piano that desperately needed tuning. He saw a family that had survived horrors that would have destroyed lesser souls, held together by the strength and sacrifice of one woman who had every reason to surrender to bitterness, but chose determination instead. And he fell in love, though he did not recognize it as such at first. What he felt was admiration, respect for her resilience and dedication. Only gradually did he come to understand that his thoughts returned to her constantly, that he found himself inventing reasons to walk past the cottage, that the sight of her smile when she praised her siblings' accomplishments made something warm unfold in his chest. The question became not whether to act, but how. He could not simply appear at her door with money, as though purchasing forgiveness for his father's sins. Charlotte Fairmont had too much pride to accept charity from the son of her family's destroyer, and he would not insult her by offering it. The solution had come to him during a conversation with Lord Pembroke about the upcoming royal ball. King William IV would be in attendance, and it was widely known that he intended to announce his choice for a new royal councillor at the event, a position that would grant significant influence over policy and reform. Alexander had been cultivating the king's favour for months, positioning himself as a candidate for the role. His ideas about criminal justice reform and economic development had impressed the forward-thinking monarch, and he had reason to believe the appointment might be his. "You will need to bring a partner, of course," Pembroke had said. "Lady Victoria Ashworth has been making rather obvious hints about her availability. Lady Victoria. Beautiful, wealthy, impeccably connected. The obvious choice for a duke seeking to advance his position, and utterly wrong." The idea had crystallized in that moment with perfect clarity. He would bring Charlotte Fairmont to the royal ball. He would present her to the king and the entire assembled aristocracy as his chosen companion. And he would publicly announce the truth about her father's innocence and his own father's guilt. It would be a declaration impossible to ignore or dismiss. The social impact would be enormous, the scandal unavoidable. But it would also restore the Fairmont name in the most public venue imaginable, forcing society to acknowledge the injustice that had been done. More than that, it would demonstrate to the king and everyone present that Alexander valued truth and justice above his own reputation or political advancement. If such honesty cost him the position of royal counsellor, then so be it. Some things mattered more than power. The plan carried enormous risk. Revealing his father's treason could taint the Lindworth name for generations. Society might turn against him for exposing such scandal. The king might view the entire situation as too controversial and choose someone else for the appointment. But as Alexander sat in his father's study, surrounded by evidence of corruption and lies, he knew there was no other choice. Charlotte Fairmont deserved justice. Her siblings deserved to grow up free from the stain of false accusations. And Alexander deserved to prove that he was nothing like the man whose title he had inherited. He would go to her tomorrow, letters in hand, and lay out his proposal. She would likely refuse at first, suspicious of his motives and hostile toward the son of Edmund Greymont. He could not blame her for that, but he would find a way to convince her. For her family's sake, for justice's sake, and perhaps for reasons he was only beginning to understand, he would find a way. The knock came just after breakfast. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the small cottage with an authority that common visitors never possessed. Charlotte looked up from the mending in her lap, her needle pausing mid-stitch as unease prickled along her spine. They received few callers, and those who did visit typically arrived with the hesitant shuffle of people uncomfortable with poverty, rather than the confident announcement of someone accustomed to respect. "I will see who it is," Thomas said, already moving toward the door with the protective instinct that had grown stronger as he had grown older. At 16, he had appointed himself guardian of his sisters, though Charlotte suspected he understood as well as she did that there was little he could actually do to shield them from the world's cruelties. Through the window, Charlotte caught a glimpse of a carriage waiting in the lane, its glossy black paint and gold trim marking it as belonging to someone of considerable wealth. Her heart began to beat faster, though she could not have said whether from fear or some other emotion she dared not name. Thomas opened the door, and Charlotte heard a deep male voice say, "Good morning. I am looking for Miss Charlotte Fairmont. I am Alexander Greymont, Duke of Lindworth." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Charlotte rose from her chair so quickly that her sewing basket overturned, spilling thread across the worn floor. Peter and Anne, who had been playing quietly in the corner, looked up with wide eyes at the sudden commotion. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, flour still dusting her hands. "Charlotte?" Thomas called, his voice uncertain. "There is a gentleman here to see you." She forced herself to walk to the door with measured steps, though every instinct screamed at her to slam it shut and bar it against the intrusion. When she reached the threshold, she found herself face to face with the man whose father had destroyed everything she held dear. Alexander Greymont was tall, with dark hair and blue eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her want to retreat. He was dressed simply for a duke, without the ostentation she might have expected, but there was no mistaking the quality of his clothes, or the bearing that came from a lifetime of privilege and power. He stood perhaps 10 years older than herself, with a serious expression that suggested he rarely smiled. "Your Grace," she said, the title tasting like ash on her tongue. "I cannot imagine what business you might have with me." Peter and Anne had crept closer, curiosity overcoming their usual shyness. Margaret stood protectively near them, one hand resting on Anne's shoulder. Thomas positioned himself between Charlotte and the Duke, his young face set in hard lines. "I would speak with you privately if I may," Alexander said, his gaze moving briefly to the children before returning to Charlotte. "It concerns your father." "My father is dead," Charlotte replied, each word sharp as broken glass. "Executed 10 years ago, based largely on testimony given by your father. I cannot think of anything you might say about him that I would wish to hear." Something flickered in Alexander's expression. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "Please," he said quietly. "I have discovered information that changes everything. Information that proves your father was innocent." The words hung in the air between them. Impossible, and yet spoken with such conviction that Charlotte felt her carefully constructed defences begin to crack. Behind her she heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath, Margaret's whispered prayer. "You are lying," Charlotte said, though her voice lacked the certainty she intended. "Why would you come here with such a cruel falsehood?" "Because it is not false," Alexander replied. He reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. "These were hidden in my father's desk. I found them 3 weeks ago while organising his papers. They are correspondence between my father and a French agent named Philippe Marchand. They detail years of treason committed by Edmund Greymont, and they explicitly describe how he framed your father to protect himself when suspicion began to fall in his direction." Charlotte stared at the letters as though they might burst into flames. "That is impossible. Your father testified under oath. The king himself accepted his word." "My father was a liar and a traitor," Alexander said flatly. "These letters prove it beyond any doubt. I have had them examined by experts who confirm their authenticity. Your father was innocent, Miss Fairmont. He died for crimes he did not commit while the true villain lived in luxury and honour." The cottage suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in as Charlotte struggled to draw breath. 10 years. 10 years of shame and struggle and endless grief, all built on a foundation of lies. "Let me see them," Thomas demanded, stepping forward with his hand extended. "Let me see these letters you claim prove my father's innocence." Alexander handed them over without hesitation. "Read them. Share them with your sisters. I want you to understand that I am not here to deceive you, but to offer what justice I can, however inadequate and delayed it may be." Charlotte watched as Thomas broke the ribbon and unfolded the first letter, his eyes moving rapidly across the page. His face paled, then flushed red with anger. "This says he planned it. Planned to make father the scapegoat. Planned to have him arrested and executed." "May I read it?" Charlotte asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Thomas passed her the letter, and she forced herself to focus on the words written in an elegant, educated hand. The contents were exactly as Alexander had described. Worse even, for they revealed not only her father's innocence, but the calculating cruelty with which Edmund Greymont had orchestrated his destruction. There was no remorse in the letters, no acknowledgement of the lives being ruined. Only cold pragmatism about eliminating a threat. Charlotte's hands shook as she read, tears blurring her vision. Behind her, she heard Margaret begin to cry, soft sobs that tore at her heart. Peter and Anne pressed close to their older sister, not fully understanding, but sensing the gravity of the moment. "Why?" Charlotte asked when she could finally speak. "Why are you showing us this? Your father is dead. This changes nothing." "It changes everything," Alexander countered. "Your family has lived under a shadow of shame for a decade. Your siblings have been denied education, opportunity, and the chance at normal lives because society believes your father was a traitor. You yourself have sacrificed any hope of marriage or happiness to care for them. That injustice cannot stand, not when I have the power to correct it." "And how exactly do you propose to correct 10 years of suffering?" Charlotte demanded, anger beginning to burn through her shock. "Will you resurrect my father? Restore my mother to life? Give me back the years I have spent as a social pariah?" "No," Alexander admitted. "I cannot undo what has been done. But I can publicly restore your father's honour. I can ensure that society knows the truth about what happened, and I can give your siblings the future they deserve." He took a breath, clearly steeling himself for what he was about to propose. "In 3 weeks, there will be a royal ball at the palace. King William will be in attendance, along with the entire upper ranks of English aristocracy. I am expected to attend, and to bring a partner. Everyone assumes I will invite Lady Victoria Ashworth, but I have refused her." "What does this have to do with us?" Thomas asked suspiciously. Alexander's gaze returned to Charlotte. "I wish to bring Miss Fairmont as my partner to the ball, and I wish to use that occasion to publicly announce the truth about what my father did, to present these letters to the king and assembled nobility as proof of your father's innocence. Such a declaration, made in that venue, cannot be ignored or dismissed. It will force society to acknowledge the injustice done to your family." The proposal was so audacious that Charlotte could only stare at him in disbelief. "You cannot be serious. The scandal would be enormous. It would taint your family name." "My family name is already tainted by what my father did," Alexander replied. "The only question is whether I will allow his corruption to remain hidden, or whether I will expose it and attempt to make amends. I choose the latter, regardless of the personal cost." "But why involve me?" Charlotte pressed. "You could announce the truth without making me a spectacle, without forcing me to face the very society that has rejected and mocked my family for years." "Because the impact will be far greater if you are present," Alexander explained. "If I simply announce the truth without you there, it becomes abstract, a historical correction. But if I bring you to the ball, if I stand beside you as I reveal what was done to your family, it becomes impossible for anyone to ignore the human cost of my father's treachery. It transforms the narrative from scandal to injustice, demanding redress." Margaret had stopped crying and was listening with fierce attention. Peter and Anne huddled together, their young faces solemn. Thomas stood with his arms crossed, clearly torn between hope and suspicion. "You said everyone expects you to bring Lady Victoria," Charlotte said slowly. "This invitation, she has considerable wealth and connections, I presume. What will she think of being passed over for a seamstress from a disgraced family?" "I care nothing for Lady Victoria's opinion," Alexander replied with surprising vehemence. "I have observed your family, Miss Fairmont. I have seen how you work from dawn until dark to provide for your siblings. I have seen how Thomas takes odd jobs despite his youth to ease your burden. I have seen Margaret's skill at managing a household with almost nothing. I have seen Peter's mathematical brilliance and Anne's musical talent, all nurtured despite impossible circumstances." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, becoming almost vulnerable. "You have achieved something remarkable in the face of tremendous adversity. You have kept your family together and given them hope for the future when you had every reason to surrender to despair. That is worth more than all of Lady Victoria's wealth and connections. That is worthy of respect and admiration." The silence that followed his words felt weighted with possibility. Charlotte looked at her siblings, seeing the hope beginning to kindle in their eyes, the desperate wish that this might somehow be real. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "This is not a decision I can make rashly." "Of course," Alexander agreed. "The ball is 3 weeks away. I will return in 2 days for your answer. In the meantime, please keep the letters. Show them to anyone you wish. Have them examined by experts if you doubt their authenticity." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I know you have no reason to trust me, Miss Fairmont. I am the son of the man who destroyed your family. But I am not my father. I believe in justice, even when it costs me dearly, especially then." After he left, the cottage erupted into chaos. Thomas paced back and forth, alternately furious and elated. Margaret clutched the letters, reading them again and again, with tears streaming down her face. Peter and Anne asked endless questions that none of them could adequately answer. Charlotte sat silent amid the tumult, her mind racing. Could she really do this? Could she walk into that ballroom on the arm of a duke and face the aristocracy that had cast her family out? Could she stand before the king and hear Alexander announce the truth about her father's innocence? The thought terrified her, but it also called to something deep within her. a hunger for vindication she had buried beneath years of pragmatic acceptance. "Charlotte, we must do this," Thomas said, kneeling before her chair. "For father, for mother, for all of us. This is our chance to reclaim what was stolen from us. But at what cost?" Charlotte whispered. "If we accept, we become dependent on the Duke's goodwill. We become objects of his charity." "It is not charity to correct an injustice," Margaret interjected softly. "It is simply right." Before Charlotte could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This time it was Mr. Hendricks, arriving for his customary afternoon visit. When he saw the letters and heard the remarkable story, the old butler sank into a chair, his weathered face transformed by wonder and relief. "I never believed it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years, I never believed the Earl could have done what they accused him of. He was a man of honour, of integrity. I knew there had to be more to the story." "Mr. Hendricks," Charlotte said urgently, "the Duke wants me to accompany him to the royal ball. He wants to announce the truth publicly. Should I accept?" The old butler was quiet for a long moment, his wise eyes studying her face. "What does your heart tell you, Miss Charlotte?" "My heart says I am terrified," she admitted. "But my heart also says my father deserves to have his name cleared. My siblings deserve to grow up without shame, and perhaps even I deserve the chance to walk into a room with my head held high, for once in 10 years. "Then you have your answer," Hendricks said gently. "Fear is no reason to refuse justice when it is finally offered, however belatedly it comes." Charlotte sat awake long into the night after Alexander's departure. The letters spread across the small table before her like evidence at a trial. The cottage was quiet around her, her siblings finally asleep after hours of excited discussion about what acceptance might mean for their futures. Only she remained vigilant, turning the decision over and over in her mind like a puzzle she could not quite solve. By morning, her choice was made. When Alexander returned 2 days later as promised, she met him at the door with her chin raised and her green eyes steady. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace. I will accompany you to the royal ball." Relief flooded his handsome features, though he quickly schooled his expression back to careful neutrality. "You honour me with your trust, Miss Fairmont. I will do everything in my power to ensure you do not regret this decision." "See that you do," she replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "My siblings are depending on this. If you fail us now, after raising such hopes, I will never forgive you." "I would not expect forgiveness for such a betrayal," Alexander agreed seriously. "But I assure you, I am committed to seeing this through, regardless of the personal consequences." Thomas emerged from the cottage, his young face set with determination. "Your Grace, I want your word. Your word as a gentleman, that you will not abandon my family once this spectacle is complete. That you will ensure the restoration of our father's title and the return of whatever properties can be recovered." Alexander met the boy's challenging gaze without flinching. "You have my word, Thomas Fairmont. More than that, you have my commitment to ensure each of you receives the education and opportunities you deserve. Your father was denied justice in life. The least I can do is ensure his children have the futures he would have wanted for them." Margaret appeared behind her brother, her flour-dusted hands wringing a dish towel. "Will Charlotte be safe? At the ball, I mean. If society is cruel to her, if they say terrible things." "I will not leave her side," Alexander promised. "And anyone who dares to insult Miss Fairmont will answer to me personally. She will enter that ballroom under my protection, and she will leave it with her father's name restored and her honour intact." Peter and Anne burst through the doorway, their 11-year-old faces bright with curiosity. "Is it true?" Peter demanded. "Charlotte is really going to meet the king?" "It appears so," Charlotte replied, reaching out to ruffle his brown hair. "Though I suspect the king will be rather less impressed with me than you imagine." "You must look absolutely magnificent," Anne declared, with the confidence of a child who had not yet learned that the world rarely cared about fairness. "More beautiful than any lady there. That way, everyone will know they were wrong about us." Charlotte's heart ached at the innocent hope in her sister's voice. She pulled both twins into an embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair. "I will do my best, little one. though I suspect I will never compete with the grand ladies in their jewels and silks. Which brings me to a rather delicate matter, Alexander interjected. Miss Fairmont, you will need an appropriate gown for the ball. I have taken the liberty of engaging the services of Madame Rousseau, the finest dressmaker in London. She will come to you here to take measurements and discuss designs. Charlotte stiffened. I cannot accept such a gift, Your Grace. It would not be proper. Consider it not a gift, but a necessity, Alexander countered smoothly. The impact of our announcement will depend in part on presentation. You must appear as the daughter of an earl, not as a woman society has forced into poverty. Your appearance will make a statement about the injustice done to your family. He's right, Charlotte, Thomas said quietly. If you appear in your mending dress, they will dismiss you as a charity case. But if you appear as you should have been allowed to appear all these years, they will be forced to confront what was taken from you. Charlotte wanted to argue further, but she recognized the truth in their words. Pride was a luxury she could not afford, not when so much depended on this single evening. Very well, but nothing too ostentatious. I will not play dress-up like some doll for their amusement. I would not dream of it, Alexander assured her. Madame Rousseau is known for her elegant restraint. I think you will find her designs both beautiful and appropriate. Madame Rousseau arrived the following afternoon in a flurry of silk samples and sketch papers, a thin Frenchwoman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She circled Charlotte with professional assessment, making small humming sounds that might have been approval or criticism. Good, she declared finally. You have good bones, good posture. The colouring, it is subtle, but striking. We will make you magnificent, my dear. I just need to look respectable, Charlotte protested weakly. Respectable? Madame Rousseau looked genuinely offended. His Grace does not hire me for respectable. He hires me for extraordinary, and extraordinary you shall be. The design she sketched was indeed beautiful, a gown of deep sapphire blue that would complement Charlotte's colouring, with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice and hem. The style was current, but not slavishly fashionable. Elegant, without being ostentatious. It's lovely, Margaret breathed, peering over the dressmaker's shoulder at the design. Charlotte will look like a princess. Better than a princess, Madame Rousseau corrected. She will look like herself, but as she was always meant to appear. This is the gift of good design, isn't it? To reveal what was always there but hidden. Over the following weeks, Alexander became a regular visitor to the cottage, ostensibly to coordinate plans for the ball, but increasingly simply to spend time with the family. Charlotte told herself his visits were merely practical, but she could not deny the flutter in her chest when she heard his carriage in the lane, or the way conversation flowed more easily between them with each encounter. They discovered shared passions for literature and philosophy, debating the merits of various reform movements, while Margaret served tea and Thomas listened with fierce attention. Alexander spoke of his plans to use his position as royal counsellor, should he receive the appointment, to push for changes in the criminal justice system and support for the poor. The current system is designed to benefit those already in power, he explained during one visit, his blue eyes animated with conviction. We treat poverty as a moral failing rather than an economic reality. We punish desperation while rewarding greed. It must change. Spoken like someone who has never experienced true poverty, Charlotte observed, though her tone held curiosity rather than condemnation. How can you understand what you have never lived? I cannot fully understand, Alexander admitted, but I can listen, I can observe, and I can use whatever influence I possess to amplify the voices of those society prefers to ignore. Charlotte found herself warming to him despite her best intentions to maintain emotional distance. He was nothing like his father. That much became increasingly clear. Where Edmund Greymont had been cold and calculating, Alexander possessed genuine warmth beneath his serious exterior. Where the old Duke had sought power for its own sake, Alexander seemed burdened by the responsibility his position entailed. Peter particularly took to the Duke, showing him complicated mathematical equations he had developed for calculating crop yields. Alexander studied the boy's work with genuine interest, even suggesting corrections that demonstrated his own considerable education. You have a remarkable gift, Alexander told Peter seriously. With proper instruction, you could attend Cambridge, perhaps become a professor or work with the Royal Society. Peter's eyes went wide. Truly? Someone like me could do such things? Why not? Alexander replied. Intelligence is not limited to those born with titles, though society often acts as if it were. Anne was shyer with the Duke, but when he noticed the old piano in the corner and asked her to play, she hesitantly agreed. Her small fingers moved across the yellowed keys, coaxing out a simple melody that nonetheless revealed natural talent. When she finished, Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That instrument deserves proper tuning. Would you permit me to send a piano tuner, Miss Anne? It would be a shame for such music to be hindered by mechanical failures." Anne looked to Charlotte for permission, and after a moment's hesitation, Charlotte nodded. "That would be very kind, Your Grace." Oh. The piano tuner arrived 2 days later, spending hours adjusting the old instrument until it sang with clarity it had not possessed in years. Anne's delight was worth any concerns Charlotte had about accepting the Duke's generosity. But not everyone viewed Alexander's attentions to the Fairmont family with approval. Rumours began circulating through London society about the Duke of Lindworth's peculiar interest in a disgraced seamstress and her siblings. The whispers reached Charlotte through her few remaining clients, ladies who commissioned her work but would never acknowledge her in public. "They say he visits you nearly every day," Mrs. Peterson mentioned with false casualness, while Charlotte fitted her for a new walking dress. "How very unusual. One wonders what business a duke could have with your family." "His Grace is a kind man who takes interest in reforming social injustices," Charlotte replied evenly, pins held between her lips as she adjusted the hem. "Perhaps more gentlemen of his station should follow his example." The rumours reached Lady Victoria Ashworth as well, and the young woman's reaction was swift and unpleasant. She appeared at Lindworth House demanding to see Alexander, only to be politely but firmly turned away by his butler. "Tell His Grace that he is making a terrible mistake," Victoria declared loudly enough to be heard throughout the entrance hall. "Associating with traitors' children will destroy his reputation. If he thinks the king will appoint him royal counsellor after such scandal, he is delusional." When Alexander heard about the visit, his expression darkened. Lady Victoria has always been more concerned with appearances than substance. "I made it clear weeks ago that I had no interest in her company. If she chooses to create drama over a decision that does not concern her, that is her choice." But Victoria did not limit herself to dramatic confrontations. She began spreading rumours of her own, suggesting that Charlotte had somehow seduced the Duke with feminine wiles, that she was a scheming adventuress using her family's tragedy to manipulate a wealthy man. The whispers reached Charlotte through Margaret, who overheard them while shopping at the market. "They're saying terrible things," Margaret reported, her young face flushed with anger. "That you're no better than a courtesan, that you're taking advantage of the Duke's sympathy." Charlotte's hands stilled on her sewing. "Let them talk. Words cannot hurt us more than we have already been hurt." But the words did hurt, adding another layer of anxiety to the already terrifying prospect of the ball. As the date drew closer, Charlotte found herself waking in the night, heart racing with panic. What if she made a fool of herself? What if Alexander's plan backfired and only brought more shame to her family? What if she simply could not bear to stand before those people and endure their judgment? 1 week before the ball, she seriously considered withdrawing. The old instinct to shield her brothers from every cruel whisper tugged her toward retreat, even as she knew this night was their only real chance at justice. She was sitting in the small garden behind the cottage, trying to calm her racing thoughts, when Alexander found her there. "May I join you?" he asked softly. Charlotte nodded, and he settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, but not so close as to be improper. "You're frightened," he observed. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if I fail? What if I cannot do this?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Charlotte? I see a woman who has already accomplished the impossible. You kept your family together through circumstances that would have broken most people. You maintained your dignity and grace despite society's cruelty. You raised your siblings to be kind, intelligent, hopeful people in a world that gave them every reason to become bitter. He turned to face her fully. If you can do all that, you can certainly survive one evening at a ball, and you will not face it alone. I will be beside you every moment. I will not let them destroy you. Charlotte searched his face, seeing something in his blue eyes that made her breath catch. Why does this matter so much to you? You could announce the truth about my father without involving me. Why take such risk? Because you deserve to be there, Alexander replied simply. Because justice is not just about facts and evidence. It is about seeing the humanity in those who have been wronged. And because, he trailed off, seeming to struggle with words. Then, with careful deliberation, he took her hand in his. Because somewhere in these past weeks, I have come to care about you and your family a great deal. More than is perhaps wise, given our circumstances. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. Your Grace, I don't. You don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I am not asking for anything in return. I simply wanted you to know that my motives are not purely about correcting my father's wrongs. They are also about ensuring that you, specifically, receive the justice and respect you deserve. Before Charlotte could formulate a response, Peter came running from the cottage. Charlotte, Mr. Hendricks is here, and he brought apples from the market. The moment broke, and Alexander released her hand, though the warmth of his touch lingered on her skin. I should go, he said, rising. But think about what I said. You are stronger than you know, Charlotte Fairmont. And 1 week from now, all of London will finally see what I have known from the beginning, that you are extraordinary. As his carriage disappeared down the lane, Charlotte pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat wild and uncertain beneath her palm. Somewhere between the discovery of the letters and this moment in the garden, something had shifted. She was no longer simply preparing to reclaim her father's honour. She was preparing to step into an entirely new life, one that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. And Alexander Greymont, Duke of Lindworth, would be standing beside her when she did. The evening of the royal ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though spring itself had conspired to make the night perfect. Charlotte stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, barely recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The sapphire gown Madame Rousseau had created transformed her completely, the rich fabric catching the candlelight and shimmering like water. Silver embroidery traced delicate patterns across the bodice, and the cut of the dress emphasized her figure without being immodest. Margaret had arranged Charlotte's hair in an elegant style, weaving small white flowers through the brown curls in a way that was both fashionable and understated. The overall effect was far more sophisticated than Charlotte had imagined possible, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe she might actually belong in the ballroom she would soon enter. You look like a princess from a storybook, Anne whispered from the doorway, her young face alight with wonder. The most beautiful lady in all of England. Hardly that, Charlotte replied, but she smiled at her sister's enthusiasm. Though Madame Rousseau has worked something close to magic with fabric and thread. It's not the dress, Thomas said, appearing behind Anne with unusual solemnity. You carry yourself differently tonight, like you remember who you really are, the daughter of an earl, not just a seamstress struggling to survive. The sound of carriage wheels on the lane sent a flutter of nervous energy through Charlotte's stomach. He was here. The moment she had been preparing for, dreading and anticipating in equal measure, had finally arrived. Remember to breathe, Margaret advised, adjusting a final curl that had escaped its pin. And remember that you have nothing to be ashamed of. You are walking into that ballroom to reclaim what was stolen from our family. Walk with your head high. Peter and Anne followed Charlotte down the narrow stairs to the cottage's main room, where Mr. Hendricks waited with tears glistening in his weathered eyes. The old butler had dressed in his finest clothes, the formal attire he had worn during his years of service to the Earl of Fairmont, carefully preserved through a decade of poverty. Miss Charlotte, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If your father and mother could see you now, they would burst with pride. You honour their memory tonight. Before Charlotte could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Thomas opened it to reveal Alexander, and Charlotte's breath caught at the sight of him. The Duke was dressed in formal evening attire that emphasized his tall, broad-shouldered frame. His dark hair was carefully styled, and his blue eyes held an intensity that made her heart race. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that truly stole her breath, wonder mixed with admiration and something deeper she dared not name. "Miss Fairmont," he said softly, seeming momentarily at a loss for words, "you are absolutely stunning." Heat flooded Charlotte's cheeks. "You are too kind, Your Grace. It is merely the skill of an excellent dressmaker." "It is far more than that," Alexander replied, stepping into the cottage. He bowed formally to her, then turned to acknowledge her siblings. "Thomas, Margaret, Peter, Anne, you should all be very proud of your sister tonight. She is about to do something remarkably brave." Peter launched himself at Charlotte, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Don't let them be mean to you. If anyone says cruel things, you can come right home." Charlotte hugged him tightly, fighting back tears that would ruin Margaret's careful work with her hair. "I will be fine, little one. The Duke will be with me." Anne joined the embrace, followed by Margaret. Even Thomas stepped forward, awkwardly patting Charlotte's shoulder in the way young men did when they wanted to show affection but felt too old for childish displays. "Bring honour back to father's name," he said gruffly. "Make them all see the truth." "I will do my best," Charlotte promised. Mr. Hendricks approached last, taking Charlotte's hand in his gnarled ones. "You were 17 years old when the world turned cruel, Miss Charlotte. You have spent 10 years being the strong one, the responsible one, the one who held everything together. Tonight, allow yourself to be simply a young woman at a ball. Allow yourself to be seen and valued as you deserve." The kindness in his words nearly undid her composure entirely. Charlotte squeezed his hands gratefully, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Alexander offered his arm. "Shall we? The carriage awaits." Charlotte took a final look at her siblings and the cottage that had been their sanctuary, then placed her gloved hand on Alexander's arm. The fabric of his coat was fine beneath her fingers, and she could feel the solid strength of him as he guided her outside. The carriage that waited was magnificent, black lacquer gleaming in the evening light, the Lindworth crest emblazoned on the door in gold leaf. A footman in immaculate livery stood ready to hand her inside, treating her with the deference usually reserved for ladies of the highest rank. As the carriage began to move, carrying them toward London and the palace, Charlotte found herself trembling despite her best efforts at composure. Alexander noticed immediately, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. "You are shaking," he observed gently. "I am terrified," Charlotte admitted. "What if I do something wrong? What if I embarrass you?" "You could never embarrass me," Alexander replied with conviction. "Charlotte, listen to me. You have already survived far worse than anything that will happen tonight. You have endured poverty, social ostracism, and the weight of caring for 4 siblings alone. A ballroom full of aristocrats cannot possibly be more challenging than what you face every day. Every day I am invisible," Charlotte countered. "Tonight I will be the center of attention. Every eye will be on me, judging, whispering, wondering what right I have to be there." Alexander's hand tightened around hers. "Let them wonder. Let them judge. By the end of the evening, they will know exactly what right you have to be there. The right of an innocent family that deserves justice and acknowledgement after a decade of undeserved shame." The streets of London passed outside the carriage windows, growing progressively more elegant as they approached the heart of the city. Gas lamps cast pools of golden light across cobblestones, and other carriages filled with nobility moved in the same direction, all converging on the palace for the season's most significant social event. "Tell me about the king," Charlotte said, needing distraction from her anxiety. "What is he like?" "King William is a practical man, less concerned with ceremony than his brother was," Alexander replied. "He values honesty and directness, which is why I believe he will respond well to tonight's revelation. He has always claimed to support justice and reform, and this will be an opportunity for him to demonstrate that support. And if he responds poorly, if he views your announcement as inappropriate scandal, then I will have done what was right regardless of the consequences," Alexander said simply. Some things matter more than royal favour. They fell silent as the palace came into view, its windows blazing with light, the sounds of music and conversation drifting through the warm evening air. Dozens of carriages lined the drive, disgorging elegantly dressed nobles who ascended the broad marble steps in glittering procession. Charlotte's heart hammered so loudly she was certain Alexander must hear it. Her palms were damp inside her gloves, and she had to concentrate on keeping her breathing steady. This was real. In moments, she would step out of this carriage and into a world that had rejected her family, that had turned its back on them when they needed support most. Charlotte. Alexander's voice drew her attention back to him. His blue eyes were serious but warm, and there was something in his expression that gave her strength. I want you to know, before we go in there, that no matter what happens tonight, I am honored to have you by my side. These past weeks, getting to know you and your family, have been among the happiest of my life. You have shown me what true courage and dignity look like. The sincerity in his words melted something frozen inside Charlotte's chest. Why are you really doing this? She asked softly. The truth, not the noble justifications about justice and honor. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because when I look at you, I see everything I value. Strength without cruelty, pride without arrogance, intelligence tempered by compassion. You deserve to be celebrated, not hidden away. And perhaps I want to be the man who stands beside you when the world finally sees what I see. Before Charlotte could process the implications of his statement, the carriage rolled to a stop. The door opened, revealing the palace steps and the crowd of nobles ascending them. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. Alexander descended first, then turned to offer his hand. Charlotte took it, using his steady strength to help her exit the carriage with as much grace as she could manage. The sapphire gown caught the light from hundreds of lamps, and she heard the first whispers begin immediately. Who is that? Not Lady Victoria, surely. Where did the Duke find such a companion? Alexander tucked Charlotte's hand securely into the crook of his elbow, his other hand coming to rest over hers in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Ready? He murmured. Charlotte lifted her chin, channeling every lesson in deportment her mother had taught her before the world fell apart. Ready. They climbed the steps together, entering the magnificent entrance hall where liveried servants waited to announce each arrival. The major domo, resplendent in palace livery, stepped forward with his speaking trumpet raised. His Grace, Alexander Greymont, Duke of Lindworth, he announced in a voice that carried through the hall and into the ballroom beyond. Then, after the briefest pause, Miss Charlotte Fairmont. The reaction was instantaneous. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The name Fairmont echoed through the assembled nobility like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of recognition and shock spreading outward in widening circles. Charlotte felt hundreds of eyes fix upon her, assessing, judging, remembering the scandal that had consumed London society a decade ago. She saw recognition dawn on face after face, followed by confusion, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed contempt. Near the entrance to the ballroom, Lady Victoria Ashworth stood frozen, her beautiful face contorting with fury and disbelief. She had clearly expected to be the Duke's companion tonight, and the sight of Charlotte Fairmont on his arm was a humiliation she had never anticipated. Across the room, Alexander's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Lindworth, swayed slightly, as though she might faint. An older gentleman beside her, presumably a family friend, steadied her with a hand on her elbow. The dowager's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on her son with an expression of horror and betrayal. But it was the figure on the dais at the far end of the ballroom that commanded Charlotte's attention. King William IV sat in an ornate chair that stopped just short of being a throne, his weathered face alert with curiosity as he observed the commotion Charlotte's arrival had caused. Unlike many of the nobles present, the king's expression held no judgment, only interest in whatever drama was about to unfold. Alexander felt the tension in Charlotte's frame and tightened his hold on her hand. "Remember," he murmured so only she could hear, "you have every right to be here." more right than many of these people who were born to privilege and never questioned whether they deserved it. With measured steps, they entered the ballroom proper. The space was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors and gilt-edged walls hung with tapestries. Musicians occupied a raised platform at one end, currently silent as everyone present focused on the extraordinary sight of the Duke of Lindworth escorting the daughter of an executed traitor into the most exclusive social event of the season. The crowd parted before them, some nobles deliberately turning away to avoid acknowledging Charlotte's presence, others staring openly with fascination. Charlotte kept her gaze forward, refusing to flinch beneath their scrutiny. She was the daughter of the Earl of Fairmont, she reminded herself. She had been raised for this world, even if it had rejected her. Your Grace. An elderly gentleman approached, his expression carefully neutral. What an unexpected pleasure to see you this evening. I was under the impression you would be accompanied by Lady Victoria. I prefer companions of substance over mere beauty, Lord Pembroke, Alexander replied coolly. Miss Fairmont has demonstrated more grace and courage than anyone else of my acquaintance. I am honoured that she agreed to attend with me. The implicit rebuke silenced Lord Pembroke, who bowed stiffly and retreated. But his attempt at confrontation had the unintended effect of drawing more attention, and soon Charlotte found herself surrounded by curious nobles, all attempting to reconcile her presence with their memories of scandal. Miss Fairmont, Lady Hartwell ventured cautiously, I confess, I did not expect to encounter you in such circumstances. The Duke's choice of companion is certainly unconventional. The Duke values integrity, Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I appreciate that quality in him, even if it strikes others as unconventional. Before the conversation could continue, the orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz. Alexander immediately turned to Charlotte, bowing with perfect formality. Miss Fairmont, would you do me the honour of this dance? Every eye in the ballroom focused on them as Charlotte placed her hand in Alexander's and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, watching as the Duke of Lindworth, one of England's most powerful and eligible men, took into his arms the disgraced daughter of a traitor. Alexander's hand settled at Charlotte's waist, warm even through the layers of fabric. His other hand clasped hers with gentle firmness as they began to move with the music. Despite her nerves, Charlotte found herself following his lead easily, years of childhood lessons in dance returning as muscle memory. You dance beautifully, Alexander murmured as they swept across the floor. You sound surprised, Charlotte replied, allowing herself a small smile. Did you think poverty had erased all my accomplishments? I think poverty has only added to them, Alexander countered. You have all the grace of a lady born to this life, combined with the strength of someone who has fought for survival. It is a remarkable combination. As they turned, Charlotte caught glimpses of the watching crowd. Lady Victoria's face was twisted with jealousy and rage. The Dowager Duchess looked as though she was still processing the shock, but King William was leaning forward in his seat, his expression one of open interest. They are all watching, Charlotte whispered. Let them watch, Alexander replied. Let them see that I have chosen to stand with you. By the end of this evening, they will understand why. The music swelled around them, and for a moment Charlotte allowed herself to simply feel the wonder of the situation. She was dancing at a royal ball, held securely in the arms of a man who looked at her as though she mattered, as though she were valuable and worthy of respect. After 10 years of invisibility, she was finally, truly being seen. And when she looked up into Alexander's face, saw the warmth and admiration in his blue eyes, she realized something that both terrified and thrilled her. This was no longer just about restoring her father's name or securing her siblings' futures. Somewhere along the way, her heart had become dangerously entangled with the Duke who had brought her here. As the waltz drew to a close, Alexander leaned close enough that his breath stirred the curls by her ear. Whatever happens next, know that I meant what I said earlier. I am honoured to stand beside you, now and always, if you will permit it. Before Charlotte could respond to his startling declaration, a palace servant approached with a message. The king requested the Duke's presence in the antechamber. The moment of revelation was at hand. The antechamber where Alexander met with King William was considerably smaller than the grand ballroom, furnished with comfortable chairs and lit by candelabras that cast warm light across velvet draperies. The king dismissed his attendants with a gesture, leaving the two men alone in the intimate space. "Lindworth," the king said without preamble, his weathered face serious, "I confess you have piqued my curiosity this evening. Miss Charlotte Fairmont is a name I recognize, though it has been many years since the scandal surrounding her family. What game are you playing?" Alexander had prepared for this moment, rehearsing his words during sleepless nights leading up to the ball. Yet now, standing before his monarch, the carefully crafted speeches seemed inadequate. He chose directness instead. "Your Majesty, I am playing no game. I have discovered evidence that proves the Earl of Fairmont was innocent of the charges for which he was executed. The true traitor was my own father, who manufactured evidence to frame the Earl and protect himself." The king's expression shifted from curiosity to sharp attention. "Those are extraordinary claims, Your Grace. I hope you have extraordinary evidence to support them." "I do, Your Majesty." Alexander withdrew the bundle of letters from his coat, handling them with the careful reverence of someone bearing both proof and condemnation. "These are correspondence between my father and a French agent named Philippe Marchand. They detail years of espionage and explicitly describe the plot to frame Earl Fairmont." King William accepted the letters and read them in silence, his face growing progressively graver. Alexander watched the monarch's reaction, seeing the moment when understanding crystallized into certainty. When the king finally looked up, his expression held both anger and a grudging respect. "You understand what revealing this will mean for your family's reputation," the king said. It was not a question. "I understand completely, Your Majesty, but I cannot in good conscience allow an innocent family to continue suffering for crimes they did not commit, while hiding the truth to protect my own comfort." The king studied Alexander for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The position of royal counsellor requires integrity above all else. Many men would have destroyed these letters and said nothing. The fact that you chose otherwise speaks to your character." He paused, then added, "Make your announcement, Lindworth. I will support you in this." Relief flooded through Alexander. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Your support means everything. Thank me by using the position you are about to receive to actually implement the reforms you have been proposing," the king replied with a slight smile. "I believe you called our current criminal justice system fundamentally barbaric in your last petition to Parliament. I stand by that assessment, Your Majesty." "Good. We shall discuss specifics later. For now, let us return to the ballroom and set right an old wrong." While Alexander was closeted with the king, Charlotte remained in the ballroom, suddenly feeling exposed without his protective presence beside her. She had positioned herself near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, hoping to make herself less conspicuous among the potted palms and decorative arrangements. It was a futile hope. "Well, well." The voice was silk over steel, unmistakably hostile. Charlotte turned to find Lady Victoria Ashworth approaching, flanked by 3 other young women whose expressions ranged from curious to openly cruel. "The mysterious Miss Fairmont. How delightful to finally make your acquaintance." Charlotte recognized the opening salvo of social warfare. She drew herself up, channeling every lesson her mother had taught her about maintaining dignity under fire. "Lady Victoria, the pleasure is mine." "Is it?" Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I wonder. It must be so overwhelming for someone of your circumstances to find yourself in such elevated company. Tell me, how did you manage to secure the Duke's attention? I am quite fascinated by your methods." The implication was clear and insulting. One of Victoria's companions, a blonde woman with a pinched face, tittered behind her fan. "Perhaps she offers services that ladies of quality cannot provide." Heat flooded Charlotte's cheeks, but she refused to let them see how deeply the barb struck. "I assure you, ladies, my relationship with His Grace is based entirely on mutual respect and shared values. Concepts that may be unfamiliar to those who view marriage as merely a financial transaction." Victoria's eyes flashed with anger at the counterattack. How dare you presume to lecture me about values? You, whose father was executed as a traitor, who spent 10 years in poverty and disgrace, what could someone like you possibly offer a duke beyond temporary amusement? I offer authenticity, Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. I offer a perspective on life that comes from actually struggling, from understanding what most people in this room will never comprehend. And I offer loyalty that is not contingent on wealth or position, because I have nothing to gain by pretending to be something I am not. Another of Victoria's companions, a dark-haired woman with cruel eyes, stepped forward. You speak of loyalty? Your father betrayed his country. Betrayal seems to run in your blood. The accusation struck deeper than Charlotte expected, touching the raw wound that had never quite healed. But as she opened her mouth to defend her father's honor, she realized with sudden clarity that she no longer had to. Alexander was even now speaking with the king, setting in motion the revelation that would vindicate the Earl of Fairmont. My father was innocent, Charlotte said quietly, but with absolute conviction. The real traitor condemned him to protect his own guilt. Very soon, everyone in this room will know the truth, and when they do, I wonder how many of you will have the courage to apologize for your cruelty. Victoria laughed, though the sound held an edge of uncertainty. Innocent? Is that the story the Duke has fed you? How pathetic that you believe such obvious lies designed to seduce you into. That is quite enough, Lady Victoria. The voice belonged to an elderly woman Charlotte did not recognize, but whose bearing and elaborate jewelry marked her as someone of considerable importance. The newcomer fixed Victoria with a withering stare. This display is beneath you. Attacking a young woman who cannot defend herself against your numbers reflects poorly on your character, not hers. Victoria's face flushed. Lady Pemberton, You were merely demonstrating why His Grace chose Miss Fairmont over you, Lady Pemberton interrupted crisply. Grace and dignity cannot be purchased with a dowry, Victoria. They must be earned through character. Now I suggest you and your companions find other entertainment before you embarrass yourselves further. The dismissal was absolute. Victoria and her group retreated with as much dignity as they could salvage, shooting poisonous glances at Charlotte as they departed. Once they were gone, Lady Pemberton turned to Charlotte with a kinder expression. Do not let them distress you, my dear. Women like Victoria Ashworth have never faced genuine hardship, so they have never developed genuine character. They sense that quality in you, and it frightens them. Thank you for your intervention, Lady Pemberton, Charlotte said gratefully. Though I fear I have made enemies tonight. You would have made those enemies regardless, the older woman replied shrewdly. The Duke chose you over every other eligible woman in London. That alone would have earned their jealousy. Better to face their hostility with your integrity intact than to have won their approval through submission. Before Charlotte could respond, a subtle change in the atmosphere of the ballroom signaled that something significant was about to occur. Conversations quieted as King William returned to his seat on the dais, with Alexander standing beside him. A royal attendant struck a ceremonial staff against the floor 3 times, calling for silence. Your attention, please, the king announced, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. His Grace, the Duke of Lindworth, has a matter of considerable importance to address. I ask that you all give him your full attention and respect. Charlotte's heart began to race. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the revelation that would either vindicate her family or make them objects of even greater scorn. She searched the crowd for a friendly face and found Lady Pemberton still standing beside her, the older woman's presence a silent offer of support. Alexander stepped forward, his tall frame commanding attention even without the king's introduction. He looked out over the assembled nobility with an expression that was both solemn and resolute. When his gaze found Charlotte across the crowded room, something in his eyes steadied her, reminding her that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander began, his voice clear and unwavering. I have asked for this opportunity to address you all because I have discovered something that weighs heavily on my conscience and demands public acknowledgement. 10 years ago, the Earl of Fairmont was convicted of treason and executed based largely on testimony provided by my father, Edmund Greymont, the late Duke of Lindworth. a ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. People shifted, exchanged glances, clearly wondering where this unusual speech was leading. For a decade, the Fairmont family has lived under the shadow of that conviction, Alexander continued. The Earl's children were denied their inheritance, their position in society, their very futures. They have endured poverty and social ostracism because of crimes their father was believed to have committed. Charlotte felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, though she fought to maintain her composure. Across the room, she could see the Dowager Duchess of Lindworth staring at her son with an expression of dawning horror. "Some weeks ago," Alexander said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I discovered hidden correspondence in my father's desk, letters between him and a French agent detailing years of espionage, letters that prove beyond any doubt that my father was the true traitor and that he deliberately framed the Earl of Fairmont to divert suspicion from himself." The ballroom erupted in shocked exclamations. Nobles turned to one another in disbelief, voices rising in a cacophony of confusion and speculation. Alexander raised his hand, calling for quiet, and gradually the crowd settled enough for him to continue. "I have these letters with me," he said, holding up the bundle he had shown to the king. "His Majesty has examined them and confirmed their authenticity. They contain explicit instructions about manufacturing evidence, about ensuring the Earl would be convicted and executed. My father condemned an innocent man to death to protect his own treacherous activities." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of revelation. Charlotte felt tears spilling down her cheeks now, unable to contain them any longer. 10 years of grief and shame were being lifted from her shoulders in this moment, acknowledged before all the people who had turned their backs on her family. "I stand before you today to formally declare that the Earl of Fairmont was innocent," Alexander proclaimed, his voice ringing with conviction. "He was a loyal servant of England who died for crimes he did not commit. And I, as the son of the man who perpetrated this injustice, offer my deepest apologies to his family." Alexander turned, looking directly at Charlotte across the crowded ballroom. Miss Charlotte Fairmont and her siblings have demonstrated remarkable strength and dignity in the face of undeserved persecution. They deserve not our contempt, but our admiration and respect. I have petitioned His Majesty to restore the Earl's title posthumously, and I am pleased to announce that he has agreed to do so. King William stood, drawing all eyes to him. "I have examined the evidence the Duke has presented," the monarch said with grave authority. "It is conclusive. The Earl of Fairmont will be remembered as a loyal subject who was wronged by treachery. His title and whatever properties can be recovered will be restored to his heir. Let it be known throughout England that this family's honour has been vindicated." The response from the assembled nobles was mixed. Some broke into applause, moved by the drama and justice of the moment. Others stood frozen in shock, still processing the revelation. A few, including Victoria and her companions, looked merely humiliated by how wrong their earlier cruelty now appeared. Charlotte stood transfixed, unable to move as people turned to stare at her with expressions transformed from contempt to curiosity, from judgment to respect. She felt Lady Pemberton squeeze her arm encouragingly. Alexander descended from the dais and made his way through the crowd toward Charlotte. People parted before him, and when he reached her side, he took her hand with gentle reverence. "Your father's name is cleared," he said softly, reaching up to brush away the tears on her cheeks with his thumb. "You and your siblings are free from the shadow that has darkened your lives. You are the daughter of a loyal earl, Charlotte. You always were." Charlotte looked up at him through her tears, seeing in his blue eyes everything he had risked for this moment. His reputation, his family's standing, his own comfort and security. All of it sacrificed to give her family the justice they deserved. "Thank you," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate to express the gratitude and something deeper that swelled in her chest. "Thank you for believing us, for fighting for us. I would fight the world for you," Alexander replied, so quietly that only she could hear. "You must know that by now." Before she could respond, the king spoke again. "I have another announcement to make this evening. After considerable deliberation, I have chosen my new royal counsellor. It is a position that requires not only intelligence and political acumen, but integrity and moral courage, qualities that have been demonstrated most admirably tonight. The king smiled. Alexander Greymont, Duke of Lindworth, I offer you the position of royal counsellor. May you serve England with the same dedication to truth that you have shown, not only this evening, but in your efforts long before it. The applause that followed was thunderous, genuine admiration for a man who had chosen honour over convenience. Alexander bowed deeply to the king, accepting the appointment with visible humility. When he straightened and turned back to Charlotte, his expression held something new, hope mixed with an emotion that made her breath catch. Around them, the ballroom buzzed with conversation as nobles processed the evening's extraordinary revelations. But for Charlotte and Alexander, the crowd seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of shared understanding. The Dowager Duchess of Lindworth approached then, her face pale but her bearing still proud. She looked at her son, then at Charlotte, and something in her severe expression softened fractionally. Miss Fairmont, she said formally, I owe you an apology for my earlier reaction. I see now that my son has acted with honour, even at great potential cost to our family. You are welcome in the Lindworth household. It was not a warm declaration, but coming from a woman who clearly valued propriety above emotion, it was significant. Charlotte curtsied respectfully. Thank you, Your Grace. Your son is a man of remarkable integrity. You should be very proud. I am, the Dowager admitted, surprising them both, more proud tonight than I have ever been. As the evening continued and nobles began to approach Charlotte with belated congratulations and awkward apologies, she kept returning to the memory of Alexander's hand wiping away her tears, the warmth in his eyes, the promise implicit in his words. Something had shifted irrevocably between them tonight, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The ball that had begun with such anxiety would end, Charlotte sensed, with her entire future transformed. Not just her social standing or her family's prospects, but her heart itself, which had somehow become irrevocably entangled with the Duke who had given her back her name and offered her, perhaps, the chance at happiness she had long since stopped believing possible. The ballroom seemed transformed after Alexander's revelation, as though the very air had shifted. Where moments before Charlotte had felt the weight of hostile judgment, she now found herself surrounded by a different sort of attention. Curiosity mixed with grudging respect, and in some cases, shame at how the Fairmont family had been treated. Miss Fairmont, Lord Pemberton approached with his wife, both wearing expressions of carefully constructed contrition. I must offer my deepest apologies. Had we known the truth about your father, we would never have, that is to say, the way society treated your family was unconscionable. Charlotte accepted his words with a gracious nod, though she noted that his apology was contingent on knowing the truth, rather than on the basic decency of treating struggling people with kindness. Thank you, Lord Pemberton. I appreciate your sentiments. Others followed in a steady stream, nobles who had ignored or disparaged her family for a decade, suddenly eager to express sympathy and support. Each interaction required Charlotte to maintain perfect composure, while accepting apologies from people who would never have acknowledged her existence had Alexander not forced them to confront the truth. Your strength through such adversity is admirable, Lady Hartwell murmured, pressing Charlotte's hand. This from a woman who had once employed Charlotte to sew a gown, then pretended not to recognize her when they passed on the street. You are too kind, Charlotte replied, her voice even despite the bitter irony of the situation. Alexander remained at her side throughout, a solid presence that communicated clearly to everyone present that Charlotte was under his protection. When someone's apology seemed particularly insincere, he would interject with a pointed comment about the importance of showing kindness to those in difficult circumstances, regardless of their guilt or innocence. After all, he said to one gentleman who had been effusive in his regret, Miss Fairmont's character would have been equally admirable even if her father had been guilty. The fact that society abandoned children for their parents' alleged crimes speaks poorly of our collective values. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude for his unwavering support. Not everyone approached with apologies. Some nobles maintained their distance, uncomfortable with the revelation, but unwilling to fully acknowledge their complicity in the Fairmont family's suffering. Charlotte found she preferred their honest avoidance to the hypocritical contrition of those who suddenly claimed to have always suspected an injustice. The most painful interaction came from an elderly woman who had been friends with Charlotte's mother. Lady Whitmore approached with tears in her eyes, her lined face etched with genuine remorse. "Charlotte," she said, using her given name with the familiarity of old friendship. "I am so deeply sorry. Your mother was my dearest companion, and when she needed support most, I abandoned her. I convinced myself that maintaining social standing mattered more than loyalty. I was wrong, and I have regretted it every day since." This apology, unlike the others, felt authentic. Charlotte found herself embracing the older woman, her own tears flowing freely. "Mother would forgive you, Lady Whitmore." She understood the pressures society places on people to conform. "But you should not have to forgive me," Lady Whitmore replied, pulling back to look Charlotte in the eyes. "You and your siblings suffered terribly, and those of us who could have helped chose our comfort instead. That shame is ours to carry." As Lady Whitmore retreated, Charlotte felt Alexander's hand at the small of her back, steadying her. "Are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "Better than I expected," Charlotte admitted, "though it is surreal to receive apologies from people who would have cut me dead in the street yesterday. Such is the nature of society," Alexander replied with a touch of cynicism. "They follow power and consensus rather than principle. But at least now they are following in the right direction." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Victoria, who had clearly spent the past half hour working up the courage to approach. Her beautiful face was composed, but Charlotte could see the desperation beneath the careful facade. "Your Grace," Victoria addressed Alexander, while pointedly ignoring Charlotte. "Might I have a word with you? Privately?" Alexander's expression cooled. "Anything you wish to say to me may be said in Miss Fairmont's presence." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Please, Alexander, I only need a moment to speak with you. As someone who has known you for years, surely I deserve at least that courtesy." Charlotte sensed Alexander's reluctance, but also his ingrained politeness. "It's all right," she said softly. "I will wait here." "I will not be long," Alexander promised, his eyes conveying an apology as he allowed Victoria to lead him a short distance away, though still within sight of Charlotte. From her position, Charlotte could not hear their conversation, but she could read much from their body language. Victoria spoke urgently, her hands gesturing expressively. Alexander's posture remained stiff, his responses brief. At one point, Victoria reached out to touch his arm in a gesture that seemed calculated to suggest intimacy, and he stepped back, putting clear distance between them. Lady Pemberton, who had remained near Charlotte, made a disapproving sound. "That girl has no sense of propriety. The Duke has made his choice clear, yet she persists in embarrassing herself. She is in love with the idea of being a Duchess," Charlotte observed quietly. "That is harder to let go of than affection for any particular person." The conversation between Alexander and Victoria grew more heated, Victoria's voice rising enough that Charlotte caught fragments. "Never truly accepted your position. Needs a wife from proper society." Alexander's response was too quiet to hear, but his expression had hardened into something implacable. He said something final that made Victoria's face flush with humiliation and anger. Then he turned and walked back to Charlotte without a backward glance, leaving Victoria standing alone in the middle of the ballroom. "What did she want?" Charlotte asked as Alexander reclaimed his place at her side. "To convince me that you would be a liability to my position as royal counsellor," Alexander replied bluntly. "She suggested that society would never truly accept you, and that I needed a wife from established aristocracy to be effective in my new role." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that I would rather be effective with you by my side than powerful without you," Alexander said, his blue eyes intense. "I told her that any society that cannot recognize your worth is not worth courting. And I told her that my choice of companion is final and not subject to her approval or anyone else's." Charlotte's breath caught at the implication in his words. Before she could respond, they saw Victoria gathering her companions and making her way toward the exit. Her departure from the ball, more flight than graceful withdrawal. She will leave London, Lady Pemberton predicted. Retire to some country estate until the gossip dies down. The humiliation of being so publicly rejected in favour of… She paused, seeming to realise how her words might sound. In favour of true worth over superficial connections will be too much for her pride to bear in society's presence. The king's voice rang out again, drawing everyone's attention back to the dais. Before the evening's festivities continue, I have one more announcement. After considerable deliberation regarding who should serve as my royal counsellor, I have made my decision. The ballroom fell silent with anticipation. Several nobles who had been positioning themselves for the appointment stood straighter, hoping to hear their names. The position requires not only political skill, but integrity and moral courage, King William continued. These qualities have been demonstrated most admirably this evening by Alexander Greymont, Duke of Lindworth, who chose truth and justice over personal convenience and family reputation. The king smiled warmly at Alexander. Your Grace, I offer you the position of royal counsellor. I trust you will serve England with the same dedication to what is right that you have shown tonight. The applause that erupted was genuine and enthusiastic. Even those who might have hoped for the appointment themselves seemed moved by the justice of the king's choice. Alexander bowed deeply, accepting the honour with visible humility. Your Majesty, I am honoured beyond words, he said. I pledge to serve England and your throne with integrity and dedication to the welfare of all your subjects, not merely the privileged few. As Alexander returned to Charlotte's side, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Not only had her father's name been cleared, but Alexander had been rewarded rather than punished for his honesty. The gamble had paid off in ways she had not dared to imagine. You did it, she whispered, as the crowd pressed close with congratulations. You risked everything, and you won. We won, Alexander corrected gently. Your courage in coming here tonight was essential. The truth alone would not have had the same impact without you present to represent the human cost of injustice. The celebrations continued around them, but Charlotte found herself growing weary of the crowd, the noise, the endless stream of people wanting to speak with either her or Alexander. She longed for quiet, for a moment to process everything that had happened. As if sensing her need, Alexander leaned close. Would you care to take some air? The palace gardens are quite beautiful in the moonlight. Charlotte nodded gratefully, and he guided her through the crowd toward the doors that opened onto the terrace. The cool evening air was a blessed relief after the stuffiness of the ballroom, and Charlotte drew a deep breath as they descended marble steps into the formal gardens below. Lanterns hung in the trees, casting soft light across perfectly manicured lawns and flower beds. The sounds of music and conversation from the ballroom faded to a gentle background hum as they walked deeper into the gardens, following a path that wound between hedges shaped into geometric patterns. How are you truly feeling? Alexander asked once they were alone. I know tonight has been overwhelming. I feel as though I am living in a dream, Charlotte admitted. This morning I was a seamstress in a cottage. Tonight I am the daughter of an earl whose honour has been restored before the king and all of London society. It is too much change to fully comprehend. They reached a small fountain, its water sparkling in the lamplight, and Alexander guided Charlotte to sit on the marble edge. He remained standing, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart race. There is something I need to tell you, he said, his voice serious. Something I have been trying to say for weeks, but could never find the right moment or words. Charlotte's hands clasped together in her lap, suddenly nervous. What is it? Alexander knelt before her, taking her hands in his. The gesture was so unexpected that Charlotte gasped. When I first discovered the letters proving your father's innocence, I told myself I was acting purely out of duty and a desire for justice. And that was true at first. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. But somewhere during these past weeks, watching you with your siblings, seeing your strength and grace and intelligence, my motivations changed. It stopped being only about righting my father's wrongs. It became about you specifically, about ensuring that you received the respect and opportunities you deserve. Alexander? Charlotte whispered, afraid to hope she understood what he was saying. I am in love with you, Charlotte, he said simply. his blue eyes earnest. "I love your courage and your compassion. I love how you have sacrificed for your family without becoming bitter. I love your mind and your wit and the way you see through society's pretensions to the heart of what truly matters. I love you, and I cannot imagine my future without you in it." Tears spilled down Charlotte's cheeks for what felt like the 100th time that evening. But these were tears of joy mixed with fear. "I love you too," she admitted. "I've been trying not to, because it seemed impossible. But I love you, Alexander. You have shown me kindness and respect when the world offered only cruelty. You have fought for my family and asked nothing in return. How could I not love you? Then marry me," Alexander said urgently. "Not because of duty or obligation, or to secure your family's position. Marry me because you want to spend your life with me, as much as I want to spend mine with you." Charlotte's mind raced with all the obstacles that stood between them. "I have no dowry, no training as a duchess. I do not know how to manage grand estates or navigate the complexities of your social world. And I cannot abandon my siblings. They still need me. Your siblings will be my siblings," Alexander replied firmly. "Thomas will receive education and training to properly manage the Fairmont estates. Margaret will have a proper debut when she is ready. Peter will have the finest mathematics tutors in England. Anne will study music with the best instructors. They will want for nothing, and you will be free to be more than just their caretaker." He squeezed her hands gently. "As for knowing how to be a duchess, you already possess the most important qualities: integrity, compassion, and intelligence. The rest is merely protocol that can be learned. My mother will help despite her initial shock, and you will have me beside you always." Charlotte looked into his eyes, seeing only sincerity and love. All her life, she had been responsible for others, putting their needs before her own dreams. But here was someone offering to share those burdens, to stand with her, rather than expecting her to stand alone. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Alexander's face transformed with joy. He rose, pulling Charlotte to her feet and into his arms. His hand cupped her cheek as he lowered his mouth to hers, in a kiss that was tender and promising, filled with all the emotion they had both been containing. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, Charlotte rested her forehead against Alexander's chest. "How did this happen?" she wondered aloud. "How did my life change so completely in such a short time?" "Sometimes justice and love arrive together," Alexander replied, his arms tightening around her, "though neither comes easily or without cost." "No regrets?" Charlotte asked, looking up at him. "About exposing your father, about what it might mean for your family's reputation. My only regret is that I did not find those letters sooner," Alexander said firmly. "That you and your siblings suffered even one more day than necessary under that shadow. But for tonight, for this moment, I have no regrets at all, only hope for our future together." They stood in the garden for a long while, holding each other beneath the stars, the distant sounds of the ball a reminder of the world they would return to. But for now, perfectly content in this private moment of joy and promise. The weeks following the royal ball passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Charlotte's head spinning. What had once seemed an impossible dream became reality with startling speed, as though the universe itself was eager to compensate for a decade of suffering. Alexander wasted no time in making arrangements for the Fairmont family's future. 3 days after the ball, a carriage arrived at the cottage to transport Charlotte and her siblings to Willowmere, one of Alexander's smaller estates located just outside London. The property was considerably more modest than Lindworth itself, but to children who had spent 10 years in a cramped cottage, it seemed palatial. "This is all for us?" Anne breathed as they stood in the entrance hall, staring up at the chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across marble floors. "Temporarily," Alexander explained, though his smile suggested he found their wonder endearing. "Until the wedding, after which you will divide your time between here and Lindworth proper. I thought you might appreciate having space to settle before being thrust into the main estate." Thomas walked through the rooms with the bearing of someone trying not to appear overwhelmed but failing completely. "There are more bedrooms here than in our entire cottage," he observed. "Where will we even sleep?" "Wherever you like," Alexander replied. Choose rooms that suit you. Make this place your home. Margaret selected a sunny chamber overlooking the gardens, immediately beginning to arrange the simple belongings they had brought with plans for how she might decorate once she had proper furnishings. Peter and Anne claimed adjacent rooms, already scheming about how they might create a passageway between them for midnight conversations. Charlotte stood in what would be her temporary quarters, a beautiful suite decorated in soft greens and golds, and felt tears threatening again. After years of sharing a single small room with Margaret, having such space felt almost decadent. Too much? Alexander asked from the doorway, watching her with concern. Perfect, Charlotte corrected, turning to face him. Everything is perfect, Alexander. Almost frighteningly so. I keep waiting to wake up and find this was all a dream. He crossed the room to take her hands. I promise you, this is entirely real, and it is only the beginning. True to his word, Alexander immediately set about securing the futures he had promised each of Charlotte's siblings. A tutor arrived for Thomas within the week, a serious man named Mr. Davies, who specialised in estate management and would prepare the young Earl Fairmont to properly oversee his inherited properties once they were formally restored. The king has signed the documents, Alexander explained to the family over dinner one evening. Your father's title is officially restored posthumously, which means Thomas, as the eldest son, inherits the earldom. You are now Thomas Fairmont, Earl of Fairmont. Thomas sat very straight in his chair, clearly struggling to process this transformation. I am an earl, he said wonderingly. After all these years of being nobody, I am an earl. You were never nobody, Charlotte corrected gently. But yes, now society will acknowledge what was always true, that you are the son of a nobleman and deserving of respect. Not all of the original Fairmont properties could be recovered. Some had been sold to buyers who held legitimate claims, and Alexander advised against lengthy legal battles that might drain resources better used elsewhere. But the family's principal estate in Derbyshire was returned, along with several smaller holdings that would provide Thomas with a respectable income. For Margaret, Alexander arranged for a governess who would provide the education and social polish expected of young ladies preparing for their debut. Miss Hartley arrived with trunks full of books and a kind but firm manner that quickly won Margaret's respect. We will begin with French and Italian, Miss Hartley announced, then move on to watercolours, needlework, and the proper management of a household. By the time you are ready to enter society, you will be accomplished in all the arts expected of a lady. Margaret embraced these lessons with enthusiasm, hungry for the education she had been denied. Charlotte often found her sister practicing French pronunciation late into the evening, determined to master every skill that might help her succeed in the world that had once rejected their family. Peter's mathematical gifts received special attention. Alexander brought in Professor Whitmore from Cambridge, who spent an afternoon testing the boy's knowledge before declaring him a genuine prodigy. With proper instruction, he could make significant contributions to the field, the professor told Alexander and Charlotte. I would be honoured to tutor him myself, preparing him for eventual admission to Cambridge when he comes of age. Peter glowed under this attention, spending hours each day working through complex problems and theories that made Charlotte's head ache just looking at them. But she loved seeing her brother's gifts finally recognised and nurtured as they deserved. Anne received instruction from Madame Leclerc, a renowned music teacher who proclaimed the girl's natural talent worthy of serious development. The newly tuned piano at Willowmere saw constant use as Anne practiced scales and increasingly complex pieces, her small fingers growing nimbler with each passing day. She has real potential, Madame Leclerc told Charlotte, not merely as an accomplished young lady who plays for drawing room entertainment, but as a genuine musician. If she continues to apply herself, she might even perform publicly someday. Watching her siblings flourish under Alexander's generous patronage filled Charlotte with gratitude so profound it sometimes overwhelmed her. These children who had been denied so much were finally receiving the opportunities they deserved, and it was all because of the man she was going to marry. The wedding itself was planned for 6 weeks after the ball, a timeline that raised some eyebrows among society matrons who felt a longer engagement would be more proper. But Alexander was adamant that he saw no reason to delay, and Charlotte found herself agreeing. After 10 years of waiting for her life to begin, She had no desire to postpone happiness any longer. Mr. Hendricks was offered and accepted the position of head butler at Lindworth, a role that brought him to tears when Alexander formally extended the invitation. "You cared for the Fairmont family when no one else would," Alexander told the elderly man. "You deserve to be part of what comes next, to see the children you helped raise finally receive the lives they should have had all along." The wedding day arrived with crystalline autumn weather, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to promise good fortune. The ceremony would take place in the chapel at Lindworth, a beautiful stone structure that had served the Greymont family for generations. Charlotte woke early in her chambers at Willowmere, her heart fluttering with nervous anticipation. Margaret helped her dress in the gown that had been created for the occasion. Simple white silk with delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline, elegant without being ostentatious. "You look like an angel," Anne declared, watching as Margaret arranged Charlotte's hair in loose curls adorned with small white roses. "I look like someone getting married," Charlotte corrected with a smile, though she had to admit the reflection in the mirror showed a woman transformed from the exhausted seamstress she had been mere weeks ago. The carriage ride to Lindworth was brief, but felt eternal, Charlotte's anticipation building with each passing moment. When they arrived, she found the chapel already filled with guests, not the hundreds who had attended the royal ball, but a more intimate gathering of people who genuinely mattered. King William sat in the front pew, having honoured them with his presence despite the informality of the occasion. Lady Pemberton was there, along with several other nobles who had proven themselves true friends rather than fair-weather acquaintances. The Dowager Duchess of Lindworth sat with dignified composure, and while her expression remained somewhat stern, she had softened considerably toward Charlotte in recent weeks. But it was Mr. Hendricks who would walk Charlotte down the aisle, the old butler dressed in his finest clothes, and looking both proud and emotional as he offered his arm. "Your father would be so happy to see this day," he whispered as they prepared to enter the chapel. "To know that his daughter found not just vindication but genuine love. I wish he could be here," Charlotte admitted, her eyes misting. "He is here," Hendricks replied firmly. "In spirit, watching over you and blessing this union. I am certain of it." The chapel doors opened, and Charlotte's breath caught at the sight before her. The small space was decorated with white roses and candles that cast warm, flickering light across stone walls. And at the altar, waiting with an expression of wonder and love that made her heart soar, stood Alexander. He wore formal attire that emphasized his tall, powerful frame. But it was his face that held Charlotte's attention, as she walked slowly down the aisle on Mr. Hendricks's arm. She saw tears gathering in Alexander's eyes, saw the way his hands clenched and unclenched, as though he was restraining himself from rushing to meet her halfway. When they reached the altar and Mr. Hendricks placed Charlotte's hand in Alexander's, the old butler's voice cracked as he said, "Take care of her, Your Grace. She is very precious." "I will cherish her always," Alexander promised solemnly. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and prayers, words that bound them together not just legally, but spiritually. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander cupped Charlotte's face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "Hello, Duchess," he murmured before kissing her with a tenderness that brought tears to many watching eyes. The reception that followed was small but joyful, held in Lindworth's morning room with its tall windows overlooking the estate's gardens. Thomas stood to give a toast, his young voice steady despite his emotion. "Your Grace, Alexander, you restored more than my family's honour," he said. "You gave us back our futures. You saw value in us when the world saw only shame. My father would have thanked you, and since he cannot, I will do so on his behalf. You are the finest man I know, and I am honoured to call you brother." Margaret presented Charlotte with a bouquet of flowers from Willowmere's gardens, her eyes shining as she whispered, "You are a hero, Alexander. You saved us all." Even the Dowager Duchess unbent enough to embrace Charlotte and murmur, "Welcome to the family, my dear. I believe you will make an excellent Duchess, despite my initial doubts." King William departed after offering his congratulations, but not before pulling Alexander aside for a private word that left the new royal counsellor smiling with satisfaction. As afternoon faded into evening and guests began to depart, Charlotte found herself finally alone with Alexander in the library that had become their favorite refuge. He pulled her into his arms, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," Charlotte admitted. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is real." "Believe it," Alexander replied, kissing the top of her head. "This is only the beginning of our story, Charlotte. We have a lifetime ahead of us." 6 months after the royal ball, Charlotte stood beside Alexander at the edge of what had once been the cottage where her family had struggled to survive. The small building had been transformed into a school for children from poor families. The first of several such institutions Charlotte and Alexander planned to establish throughout England. "Education should not be limited to those who can afford tutors," Charlotte explained to the gathered crowd at the school's opening. "Every child deserves the opportunity to develop their talents, regardless of their circumstances." Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. In the 5 months since their wedding, Charlotte had fully embraced her role as Duchess of Lindworth, working alongside Alexander on the social reforms he had promised to implement as royal counsellor. They had developed programs to help families wrongly accused of crimes, established funds to support widows and orphans, and pushed for changes to the criminal justice system that would make such miscarriages of justice less likely in the future. Thomas was thriving as Earl of Fairmont, managing his restored estates with wisdom beyond his years. Margaret had made a successful debut and was currently being courted by a kind young viscount who valued her intelligence as much as her beauty. Peter continued his mathematical studies with Professor Whitmore, while Anne's musical talents were developing beautifully under Madame Leclerc's instruction. The Fairmont family, once broken and scattered, had been made whole again, not just restored to their former position, but elevated beyond it by the love and opportunities they now enjoyed. As the sun began to set over Lindworth's grounds, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Charlotte and Alexander stood together overlooking the estate that was now their shared home. Alexander's arms wrapped around her from behind, his hands settling gently over her rounded stomach. "Do you remember what you said that first day in the cottage?" Charlotte asked softly. "When you told me about the letters?" "I said many things," Alexander replied, his breath warm against her ear. "You said you wanted to correct an injustice," Charlotte reminded him. "But you gave me so much more than justice, Alexander. You gave me back my family's honor, yes, but you also gave me love, purpose, and hope for the future. You gave me everything." "You gave me just as much," Alexander countered, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. "You taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or wealth. You showed me what courage really looks like. And you gave me a love I never thought I would find, genuine, deep, and built on mutual respect and admiration." Charlotte reached up to cup his face, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. "We have built something beautiful together. Not just our marriage, but the chance to help others who face the kinds of injustices my family endured. And we will continue building," Alexander promised. "Together, always together." As twilight settled over Lindworth and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Charlotte felt a peace she had never known in all her years of struggle. Justice had been served, love had been found, and the future stretched before them bright with promise. The daughter of an executed earl and the son of a traitor had created something pure and good from the ashes of their father's sins. And in doing so, they had proven that redemption was always possible, that love could triumph over injustice, and that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships could change not just 2 lives, but an entire world. Dear listener, may you always remember that your worth is not determined by others' opinions or society's judgments. Like Charlotte, you possess strength and dignity that cannot be taken away, only temporarily obscured. And like Alexander, may you have the courage to choose what is right over what is convenient, to stand with those who have been wronged, and to build a future based on justice and love, rather than power and privilege. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others who need reminding that happy endings are possible, even after the darkest chapters. Until next time, may you find your own path to love and redemption.